On July 31st, 1969, 3 separate letters were received by the mail centers of the following newspapers: the Vallejo Times-Herald, the San Francisco Chronicle, and the San Francisco Examiner. Each of the 3 letters were handwritten and written in a slanted format. The 3 letters differed from one another in certain aspects, but included the same salutation, signature, and basic information. Each letter began with "Dear Editor," and then proceeded to take credit for the 2 shootings, both the Lake Herman Road murders, which took place around last Christmas, with 2 S's at the end of the word, and the girl who was shot near the Vallejo golf course on the 4th of July. These letters then went on to detail facts of the separate crimes, which were only known by police and the persons responsible. These included details about the ammunition used in each shooting, the clothing that the victims had been wearing, and the location of their gunshot wounds. Also included with each of these letters was a segment of a cipher consisting of odd numbers, letters, and characters. Each newspaper was given a third of the whole cipher, which, when arranged and deciphered, was supposed to contain the identity of the person responsible. The person who wrote the letters demanded that each portion of the cipher be put on the front page of their paper the following day, Friday, August the 1st. If not, the writer threatened to, quote, "cruise around all weekend killing lone people in the night, then move on to kill again, until I end up with a dozen people over the weekend." At the bottom of the letter, the person identified themselves for the first time, not with a nickname of any sorts, but a symbol, the infamous cross-haired circle, similar to the sights of a gun. The 3 newspapers, the Vallejo Times-Herald, the San Francisco Chronicle, and the San Francisco Examiner, struggled with how to approach this threat. If they refused to cooperate and simply handed over the letter and cipher to police, then they'd have to worry about blood being potentially on their hands. But if they gave in, they'd be giving a psychopath an outlet, and perhaps inspire copycats who could use the same brutal methods in the future. The Vallejo Times-Herald was the first to give in, publishing their third of the cryptogram in the evening edition of their August 1st paper. The San Francisco Chronicle didn't include the paper in their August 1st issue, waiting to publish until the following day, Saturday, August 2nd. Even then, they did not put it on the front page, relegating it to page 4. The Chronicle included quotes from Vallejo Police Chief Jack E. Stiltz in an article printed alongside their version of the cipher. Stiltz was a proponent of the letters being a hoax, stating that he was, quote, "still not convinced the letters and codes were written by the actual killer." Chief Stiltz urged this writer to send in a second letter with more information about the crimes in question to verify his credibility. The San Francisco Examiner ran a similar story in the Sunday edition of their paper, August 3rd, but not only included their version of the cipher, but all 3 sections of the cryptogram for people to try and decode. The Examiner's article also included more quotes from Vallejo Police Chief Jack E. Stiltz, who, quote, urged the writer to send more letters, with more facts to prove his connections to the crimes. Welcome to Unresolved. I'm your host, Micheal Whelan. This episode is the second part of my look at one of the most infamous stories in American history, that of the mysterious Zodiac killer. If you have not listened to part 1, it is highly recommended that you go back and do so before continuing any further. If you like what you hear and want to help support the podcast, you could do so by leaving the podcast a 5-star rating on either iTunes or Apple Podcast. Those that have already done so, thank you so much. If you want to go any further than that, you could head to patreon.com/unresolvedpod to become a patron. There, you can help financially support the show, and get access to exclusive content like bonus episodes, commercial-free episodes, and much more. If you don't want to fiddle around with Patreon but still want to help out the show, you could send in PayPal donations to the podcast using the email address, theunresolvedpodcast@gmail.com. Once again, that's theunresolvedpodcast@gmail.com. No spaces or dashes or anything like that. Now, without any further ado, let's get right back into the story, where law enforcement and media have just asked the writer of a mysterious series of letters to continue writing. On August 7th, 1969, the San Francisco Examiner received a response to the article published on Sunday evening. The response, which was postmarked from the day after the story was published, Monday, August 4th, was a 3-page diatribe in which the writer identified themselves for the first time, and included even more details about the 2 crimes from Napa County. Quote, "Dear editor, this is the Zodiac speaking. In answer to your asking for more details about the good times I have had in Vallejo, I shall be very happy to supply even more material. By the way, are the police having a good time with the code? If not, tell them to cheer up. When they do crack it, they will have me. On the 4th of July, I did not open the car door. The window was rolled down already. The boy was originally sitting in the front seat when I began firing. When I fired the first shot at his head, he leaped backwards at the same time, thus spoiling my aim. He ended up on the back seat, then the floor and back, thrashing out very violently with his legs. That's how I shot him in the knee. I did not leave the scene of the killing with squealing tires and racing engines as described in the Vallejo paper. I drove away quite slowly so as not to draw attention to my car. The man who told the police that the car was brown was a Negro about 40 to 45, rather shabbily dressed. I was at this phone booth having some fun with the Vallejo cops when he was walking by. When I hung the phone up, the damn Xing thing began to ring and that drew his attention to me and my car. Last Christmas, in that episode, the police were wondering as to how I could shoot and hit my victims in the dark. They did not openly state this, but implied this by saying it was a well-lit night and I could see the silhouettes on the horizon. Bullshit, that area is surrounded by high hills and trees. What I did was tape a small pencil flashlight to the barrel of my gun. If you notice, in the center of the beam of light, if you aim it at a wall or ceiling, you will see a black or dark spot in the center of the circle of light about 3 to 6 inches across. When taped to a gun barrel, the bullet will strike exactly in the center of the black dot in that light. All I had to do was spray them as if it was a water hose. There was no need to use the gun sights. I was not happy to see that I did not get front page coverage. The letter was then signed by the same crosshair symbol from the previous 3 letters, and offered up no return address of any sort. The letter itself also featured a wealth of misspelled words, which provided an interesting glimpse into the killer's mind, whether the mistakes were intentional or not. One of the words that was misspelled again and again was Christmas, which the killer continued to spell with 2 S's at the end. That trend continued with this letter. Police also began looking for the black male mentioned in the letter, described as, quote, shabbily dressed by the Zodiac. The description of the suspect's vehicle had actually come from Mike Micheal, the surviving victim of the second shooting, so this second witness could provide an interesting turn in the case. It was possible that he was homeless and had been loitering outside of the gas station where the person responsible for the crime had phoned the Vallejo police dispatcher roughly half an hour after the Blue Rock Springs shooting. This letter also marked the first time that the name Zodiac would be included in any published material, and it was clear that the person responsible for these crimes, seemingly verified by the information provided, was enjoying this game of cat and mouse with law enforcement. Police began offering up the cryptograms for anyone that would help out. Universities, FBI analysts, military code breakers, naval intelligence, etc. After all, the person behind it, this mysterious Zodiac, had promised that when the code was cracked, quote, they will have me. These experts were beginning to try and decipher the 408 characters, but an answer would present itself from the most unlikely of places. When the San Francisco Examiner had published all 3 sections of the cipher on Sunday, August 3rd, a married couple from Salinas, California had become enamored with it. Salinas is a short distance away from Monterey, California, about an hour and a half south of the San Francisco Bay Area. Donald Gene Harden lived in Salinas and worked at North Salinas High School as a history and economics teacher. He had long enjoyed immersive puzzles and codes, finding them interesting to play around with. This fascination was shared with his wife, Betty June Harden, who enjoyed trying to break these kinds of codes and puzzles for fun. When the two saw the Zodiac cipher in the weekend's newspapers, they saw a fascinating challenge to take on. Over the week, they would spend an hour here and an hour there trying to play with the puzzle, substituting actual letters for the various symbols and characters used within. This married couple, realizing that someone who sounded so self-important in the letters written to the newspapers, would likely start off any code or cipher with the most self-important letter available, I. They also figured out that this person would use the word kill in the letter, and they started their code-breaking effort from there. Quote, "We felt that kill would be used more than once." By the following weekend, the pair had come up with a potential key for the cipher, and a translation that they shared with the local papers. In full, the 408-character cryptogram was translated as, quote, "I like killing people because it is so much fun. It is more fun than killing wild game in the forest because man is the most dangerous animal of all. To kill something gives me the most thrilling experience. It is even better than getting your rocks off with a girl. The best part of it is that when I die, I will be reborn in paradise, and they I have killed will become my slaves. I will not give you my name because you will try to slow down or stop my collecting of slaves for the afterlife." The cipher then includes 18 letters at the end, which have gone undeciphered in the decades since. Donald Harden, the man responsible for the majority of the translation, stated about the message, quote, "As you can see, his spelling is rather poor, and in some places he has made errors in the use of his own cipher. Just like the previous written letters from this mysterious Zodiac, the cryptogram featured numerous misspellings. The words dangerous, animal, experience, that, die, paradise, they, slow, stop, and collecting were misspelled in that paragraph-long cipher. To experts, this was either an amateur attempting to make a cipher, or a highly intelligent individual that enjoyed making this cipher as difficult as possible to crack. This indicated that the misspellings were intentional, to try and mislead analysts. After all, within the cryptogram itself, it was noted that this individual, the Zodiac, had used 12 different symbols for the letter E. They had also used a backwards Q 16 times, for whatever reason. As police began to dig through this cipher, it was clear that the person behind it was not intending to give up anytime soon. After all, he or she had told authorities that this cipher held their personal identity. Now, after deciphering it, with the exception of the final 18 characters, they were no further closer to identifying the Zodiac than they had been the week before. On September 27, 1969, a couple of young college students took a day trip to Lake Berryessa. Lake Berryessa is the largest lake in Napa County, roughly an hour north of Vallejo and Benicia. On this day in question, September 27th, the temperature exceeded 90 degrees, and two students from Pacific Union College were visiting an isolated island off of this large body of water. 22-year-old Cecelia Shepard and 20-year-old Brian Calvin Hartnell were picnicking in a quiet area along Lake Berryessa, relaxing on a blanket in the late afternoon. The sun, not yet low enough to be setting, was beginning to lower as the afternoon edged closer into evening. The area that these two college students were relaxing, on a small island connected by a sand pit to Twin Oak Ridge, was accessible by only one walking route. As they were relaxing, they heard a noise in the near distance. Brian, who was laying on his back, asked Cecelia what it was. She said it looked like a man who was anywhere between 200 and 300 yards away. Brian could hear a touch of worry in Cecilia's voice, but brushed it off. This wasn't a private lake, and there were bound to be more people in the vicinity than just them. When the man got closer, Cecelia warned Brian of his presence again. And again, he brushed it off. He got closer, about 75 yards away, before disappearing behind a tree. When Cecelia, now slightly troubled by this strange man, who she described as leering at them, began to question his actions, Brian joked. It was likely that, this far out from civilization, that the guy had stepped behind a tree to relieve his bladder. However, at some point, around 6:30 p.m., the man began lurching towards the young couple. He was now dressed all in black, and according to Cecelia, quote, "Oh my God, he's got a gun." The man approached Brian and Cecelia, pointing a pistol in their direction. Most unusually, he was wearing a dark outfit, which stood out against the backdrop of the rolling California hills behind him. It looked like he was wearing a black executioner's hood, which had clip-on sunglasses over the eye holes. The man with the gun was also wearing a bib-like device on his chest, which had an approximate 3-inch by 3-inch cross-haired symbol, which law enforcement and the media had begun to associate with a killer that had named himself Zodiac. In a brief conversation that unfolded over the next few minutes, the masked man claimed to be an escaped convict from some prison with a 2-word name. When pressed by Brian to provide information, he said that it had been either in Colorado or Montana, and at one point he made mention of Deer Lodge, an area within Montana. Continuing to aim his gun in the direction of Brian and Cecelia, the man stated that he had killed a guard during his prison break, and had then stolen a car, which was now, in his words, quote, "too hot." So now, he needed to take their car keys and the money they had so he could make his escape to Mexico. Brian and Cecelia replied, throwing over their wallets and car keys. Brian offered to help the man even more, perhaps writing him a check, or helping him out in larger ways, such as getting him mental or legal help. After all, Brian was a pre-law sociology major, and was looking forward to a career as a lawyer. He offered the man anything he could need. The man, wearing the dark hood and holding a gun, told Cecelia that he wanted her to tie up her boyfriend. He presented some pre-cut lengths of plastic clothesline and ordered her, at gunpoint, to tie up Brian. She cooperated. Then the gunman came over to the young couple and tied up Cecelia himself. He then double-checked the restraints that Cecelia had used upon Brian, tightening them to the point of inducing pain. As the gunman had grown closer, Brian asked him, quote, "Your hands are shaking. Are you nervous?" The man behind the mask chuckled softly to himself, before responding in a calm, casual manner, quote, "Yes, I guess so." Trying to keep the mood light, Brian asked another silly question. He asked the gunman if the weapon he carried was actually loaded. He wanted to know if this entire robbery was just for show. The gunman responded by quietly pulling out the clip from his pistol and showing a loaded bullet to both Brian and Cecelia. At this point, the young couple expected the strange man to take their belongings and be on his merry way. Instead, he pulled out a large knife from a holster on his belt and leaned over the young couple. Brian was the first to be stabbed. The knife pierced his back 6 times in total. One wound was particularly close to his vital organs, coming just inches away from his heart. Cecelia, who had to lie there and hear the attack being perpetrated upon Brian, began to scream and thrash about. The masked man turned his attention towards her next, stabbing her 5 times in the back as she fought and tried to break free. As she struggled, she ended up rolling onto her back, and the other man continued stabbing her. In the end, Cecelia was stabbed upwards of 10 times in total, each side of her receiving about half of the attack. After being stabbed numerous times, Brian had slowed his breathing and was pretending to have died almost instantly. To his luck, it worked. The masked man put his knife back into its sheath and began walking away in the direction he had approached the young couple. Over the next several minutes, both Brian and Cecelia, who were legitimately worried that they were going to be dying out here soon, began to struggle through pain and sheer terror. Through grit and determination, they were able to free each other from their bindings, using their teeth to rip through them. Being bound by the plastic ties had caused their hands and fingers to go numb, and since they had each been stabbed numerous times, they were at serious risk of bleeding out in a short amount of time. They continued trying to free themselves, screaming out for someone, anyone, to come and save them from this horrifying ordeal. Ronald Fong was fishing in an alcove of Lake Berryessa, along with his son, when he heard screams in the near distance. As he and his son quieted themselves, they could hear the screams intensify. This was clearly no group of teenagers playing around. These were people desperate for help. Ronald and his son began heading to the nearest place to find help, the Rancho Monticello Resort, where they would contact park rangers and let them know of the disturbance near Twin Oak Ridge. Park Ranger Sergeant William White received this call for help, and began heading towards the Rancho Monticello Resort to find out what exactly was going on. At around the same time, Park Ranger Dennis Land was driving in the area around Lake Berryessa when he came across a young man who was bleeding from several wounds to his back. It was Brian Hartnell, who had freed himself, along with Cecelia Shepard, and had climbed up towards the nearest road to get help for the two of them. Ranger Dennis Land helped Brian into his truck, and then made a call at around 7:10 p.m. for police and paramedics to come to the scene. It had been about half an hour since the crime took place, and it would be about another 30 minutes before police officials would arrive at the scene. Sergeant David Collins and Deputy Ray Land of the Napa County Sheriff's Office responded at about 7:40 p.m. Collins stated in an interview years later, quote, "It took us half an hour to arrive at the location, and we later found out, of course, that the crime had occurred at least half an hour before we were notified." The two officers began speaking to the two victims, who were still both conscious at the time of their arrival. Cecelia Shepard gave a detailed description of their attacker to Sergeant David Collins, stating that he stood about an inch or two taller than him, making him about 5'11", weighing somewhere between 175 to 200 pounds, with combed, greasy brown hair. Paramedics arrived at around 7:55 p.m., close to an hour and a half after both Brian and Cecelia had been stabbed by this masked madman. It would take them around 10 minutes for the ambulance to work its way around the burgeoning crime scene, and another 45 minutes to make it to Queen of the Valley Hospital in Napa, California. By the time they arrived at the hospital, at 8:45 p.m., Cecelia Shepard had fallen into a medical coma. She would remain in this coma for the next 2 days, until dying on September 29th from cerebral anoxia as a result of her wounds. As paramedics rushed the two young victims to the hospital, Sergeant David Collins and Deputy Ray Land began to scope out the crime scene to begin documenting everything they could find. Sergeant Collins would later state, quote, "After the ambulance took the victims to the hospital in Napa, and while waiting for detectives from the sheriff's office to arrive, Deputy Land talked to the witnesses and obtained statements from them. I began a search for evidence and discovered a footprint that led from Berryessa-Knoxville Road to the victims and back again, which was totally separate from the shoes they were wearing. When I went to the roadway, I saw the white Karmann Ghia and I saw tracks leading away from it." Sergeant Collins continued to scope out the crime scene until his attention was drawn to the white Karmann Ghia parked alongside the road. The vehicle belonged to Brian Hartnell, and the footprints from the man responsible seemed to lead straight to it. As he got closer to the car, he realized that the criminal had left behind a calling card of sorts. Quote, "I looked at the Karmann Ghia, and on the passenger door, the circle with the vertical and horizontal line through it was displayed on the door. And there were several dates, and then it ended with September 27th, 1969, 6:30 p.m., by knife, which was our crime. So he had left his calling card, which is what he had done. I recognized the symbol on the door as being the same symbol she, Cecelia Shepard, had described on the hood." The white Karmann Ghia, which was parked roughly 500 yards uphill off of Knoxville Road, had been written on in black felt-tip pen. The message read, in a series of squiggled handwriting in 5 separate lines, "Vallejo, 12/20/68, 7/4/69, September 27, 69, 6:30, by knife." The person responsible for the stabbing of Brian Hartnell and Cecelia Shepard was taking credit for the Vallejo shootings, and later analysis would confirm that this message had been written by the same person who wrote the multiple Zodiac letters. In the following days and weeks, the police would omit the final line of the message, quote-unquote by knife, from all press releases. They wanted to withhold that information to see if the person responsible included it in their correspondence, and to suss out either copycats or hoaxers that claimed responsibility for the crime. It was unknown if this person, now known as the Zodiac, had chosen a couple at random, or if he had planned out this message and intentionally targeted a light-colored vehicle. Tire tracks would be found behind Brian's white Karmann Ghia, indicating that their attacker had parked behind them before leaving. Where he had gone after perpetrating this heinous crime would be the question on everyone's mind, but police would have an answer for that very shortly. At around 7:40 that evening, at around the same time that Sergeant Collins and Deputy Land were responding to the crime scene. A call was received at the Napa County Sheriff's Office. Officer David Slate, who had been filling in on dispatch that evening, answered the call with the traditional, "Napa Police Department, Officer Slate." There was a very brief silence on the other end, before another man spoke. Quote, "I want to report a murder. No, a double murder. They are 2 miles north of Park headquarters. They were in a white Volkswagen Carmen Ghia." Officer Slate later said that the voice of the other man sounded young, early 20s in his opinion. The other man spoke calmly and clearly. Slate tried to inquire further and asked the other man where he was. He didn't answer that question, instead responding in a voice that was barely audible. Quote, "I'm the one who did it." Officer Slate's attempts to further the conversation failed, and he could hear the man on the other end of the phone set the phone down. However, the call did not hang up, so Slate continued to hear what he later described as quote-unquote clatter on the other end of the phone. This might have been the culprit setting the phone down on a shelf below the receiver, where it would later be found. He could have left the phone booth calmly, got back into his vehicle, and sped off into the night. Officer Slate contacted his superior officer, and using the technology available to them at the time, were able to speak to the operator to trace the call to the Napa Car Wash on Main Street. The car wash, where this phone booth was located, was just a few blocks away from the Napa County Sheriff's Office. It was approximately 27 miles away from the crime scene at Lake Berryessa, meaning that the person responsible must have traveled directly there, as they wouldn't have had a lot of time to stop elsewhere. KVON radio reporter Pat Stanley found the phone off of the hook just moments later. Stanley had been the news director for KVON for just a few months, and overheard a call come over the radio for anyone in the area to be on the lookout for a suspicious man around a phone booth. A few people headed out, hoping to get the scoop on the story, and Stanley, at the last minute, decided to head out to try and look around. Driving down Main Street, he happened upon the phone booth, nearby the Napa Car Wash and Sam Key Laundry Building, just minutes after the Zodiac had been there. He found the receiver, off of the hook, and was told not to touch the phone or the booth itself. When detectives arrived a short time later, they were able to lift a still wet palm print from the receiver of the phone. In the decades since, they have been unable to match that palm print with anyone.
The call to Napa police came within an hour after the stabbings. A young man's voice reported the double murder. He described the couple, their car, the scene, and hung up. Police believe it was the suspect. The call was similar to one received by Vallejo police after the shooting of a young Lover's Lane couple there earlier. There have been 3 slayings in the Vallejo area in the past year, and activities at the sheriff's office today were centered around linking the cases.
We have, of course, and have had in our department, their reports since their incidents, and being so close to their area and feeling that it might come over in our area, we, of course, have been working very closely with Vallejo in checking state hospital patients and former patients, because this guy is a pathological psycho killer. There's no doubt about it.
Police and park rangers combed the scene for clues until late yesterday. It was here the couple was picnicking, and here a man in a mask robbed, tied, and stabbed them, leaving them for dead. He got 83 cents. But police say robbery wasn't the motive. He is probably a psychopath. The 22-year-old girl from Southern California, the boy 20 from Oregon, were taken out by ambulance. Access around the lake was roadblocked for 18 hours. Sergeant Bill White was first on the scene.
Yes, the ties are a lot stronger at this time. Of course, we had this information from our original investigation, but we wanted to tie it together with the other agencies. There is, as far as I'm concerned, a definite pattern between their killings and ours. And the message left on the side of the victim's door with the dates of the Solano County murders and ours, along with other items that are on there, have definitely indicated to us that they're one and the same.
What more do you know about the killer today than you did earlier?
Well, we have progressed. We've been able to come up with more physical evidence that will be able to be used in court. What we have to do is find the suspect, of course, and be able to apply those.
Napa County Sheriff's detectives Ken Narlow and Richard Lornigan were assigned the investigation into the assault on Brian Hartnell and Cecelia Shepard. The two were contacted at approximately 8:20 p.m. on the evening of the assault, September 27, 1969. They headed straight to the hospital, arriving at around 8:50 p.m. By the time they arrived, both of the victims were in critical condition and receiving medical help. Cecelia Shepard had already fallen into a coma by the time they got to the hospital, where she would remain for the next 2 days. The detectives were able to speak with Brian Hartnell in the following hours and days, and they tried to get as many statements from him as possible. They wanted to learn everything about the attack, the route the killer had taken before and after the assault, the cadence of his voice, his mannerisms, the weapons used, etc. Brian Hartnell cooperated to the best of his recollection. He tried to recreate the conversation that had taken place between him, Cecelia, and the masked man with the gun. There were a few moments where he couldn't exactly remember what was said, because he had been fearing for his life and reacting automatically. However, he was able to describe most of the ordeal, from the first sighting of the man hundreds of feet away, by Cecelia, up to being rescued by a park ranger, and being brought to the Queen of the Valley Hospital. Brian told detectives that the assailant had an odd voice, like he was trying to mask his speech. When asked if the attacker had a southern drawl, Brian responded, quote, "Well, not a drawl, an accent." Estimates by investigators, aided by the autopsy report of Cecilia's stab wounds, revealed that the knife used by the killer had been between 10 and 12 inches long. Brian was able to add that the knife looked like it had a wooden handle. Detectives Narlow and Lornigan spoke to the police officers that had responded to the original crime scene, Sergeant Collins and Deputy Land. They viewed the crime scene itself, as well as the areas the officers had cordoned off. They were able to find shoe prints at the crime scene, which they would later determine were of a size 10.5 wing walker. Wing walkers were used primarily by paratroopers in the World War II era, which could only typically be found on military post exchanges. Investigators would later theorize that these boots were an indicator that the Zodiac was either current or former military. Naturally, this revelation about the shoe print led to an overall inquiry into the outfit worn by this masked madman. Cecelia had given an in-depth description to officers before slipping into her coma, and Brian had also described this outfit at length. A big black hood, similar to an executioner's, and a dark bib that had the Zodiac's cross-haired symbol displayed on the front. Some have since gone on to point out that this outfit looks very similar to the riot gear that Australian police in New South Wales would wear in the 1960s. If you look up the Kelly suit from that time period, you'll see that this outfit was pretty similar. Many have since gone on to state that this attack, which, despite happening at around 6:30 p.m., still happened in broad daylight, and that in doing so, the Zodiac may have been trying to state to the world that he was for real. Perhaps this costume, an exaggerated version of something a supervillain would be wearing in a comic book in the late 1960s, was indicative of just that. It's almost like the Zodiac was trying to scream to the world that he could strike at anyone, anywhere, and that ultimately, nobody was safe.
And the guy told him to take the money. He said, "I don't want it." Says, all I want to do is kill you people. I have to kill you. The boy asked him, said, "You really mean that?" And he said, "Yes, I mean it." Says, well, he said, "If you're going to said, kill me first, because I can't stand to see the girl be stabbed." He said, "Well, I'll do that." So he started stabbing the kid in the back. He told me 10, 12 times, but he had so much blood on him I couldn't tell. I knew he was stabbed several times. And then he stabbed the girl. So,
the boy was conscious enough to give you a description of the man?
Oh, yes, they'd go out and come back, and it was taking some 35 minutes for the ambulance to get from Napa up here, which is 25 miles away from this place. And so they did a lot of talking. The boy thought he wasn't gonna make it. He wanted to give a description to the guy best he could. About the best he could give us, that he had a hood over his face, and he was a big guy. 6 foot or better, over 200 pounds.
What was your reaction when you saw them?
Well, I've been patrolling this lake now 11 years, and I've seen a lot of people that have been cut up by boats and this and that, and for no reason at all. That's about the worst I ever seen. The kids just chopped up, real nice college kids, just stabbed for no reason at all. I never witnessed anything like it before.
During the course of the investigation, detectives were able to come across a witness sighting which had immediately piqued their interest. On the day of the attack on Brian Hartnell and Cecelia Shepard, September 27th, 3 young women had described a couple of odd encounters with a young man who was leering at them along Lake Berryessa. The 3 young women, students at the same school that Brian and Cecelia attended, Pacific Union College, stated that they first saw the man at a nearby A&W restaurant, located a few miles away from the lake at Sugarloaf Park in St. Helena. They told police that the young man had seemed to follow them in a 2-door Chevy sedan, which could have been either silver or light blue in color. They stated definitively that it had California plates. Sometime later that afternoon, just a short time before the attack on Brian and Cecelia took place, the girls were sunbathing along the lake when they noticed the young man leering at them. He seemed to want to avoid eye contact, but it was almost indisputable that he was peeping on them in some fashion. They described him as being a white male who was relatively good-looking, despite the inherent creepiness attached to his profile. He was somewhere in the range of 28 to 40 years old, standing around 6 feet tall, weighing between 200 to 225 pounds, with styled black hair, round eyes, thin lips, and a build that was either muscular or stocky. These 3 young women were able to help police create a sketch which is unsettling to say the least. That may just be my own personal bias creeping in, but the artist's depiction created by the memory of these 3 young women has remained closely tied to the investigation in the decades since. A short time after the violent attack took place, at around the same time Brian and his friends began mourning the loss of Cecelia Shepard, investigators approached him once again to provide insight into the incident. They were hoping that he could be able to identify the gun that the Zodiac had been carrying, as that would help them out significantly with their investigation. Brian was shown a variety of weapons, including different brands and models. Brian was unable to differentiate between any of them. His recollection of the weapon brandished by the Zodiac was now too muddled to be of any help. Police then showed him a variety of bullets, in the hopes that he could at least identify one of those. After all, the man at the lake had taken out a bullet to showcase that the gun was loaded, and he had shown it directly to Brian. Brian could not be absolutely certain, but he identified a .45 caliber semi-automatic bullet with brass casing as the one the masked man had shown him. It was not a definitive lead, but it was something, and police would incorporate that detail into their case notes as a tentative lead. Brian Hartnell spoke to some media outlets about the crime that had taken place, perpetrated against him and his friend, Cecelia Shepard.
I considered him a robber. I had absolutely no thought that he was anything but that. And when we were at this robbery stage, I didn't consider any real threat to my life or to the girl or anything. I really didn't consider this, but I really wanted to help him. And
did he seem as though he would like your help at all?
No, he didn't, and he didn't even end up taking the money. But I don't think that he was acting under his total complete consciousness. And when a man is, if you don't mind using the word sick, you can't hold this against them. But the real concern that I have is that he doesn't do this again. I'd like to see some people save this experience.
If I remember right, in speaking with one of the deputies who was investigating this thing, he said that the first thing you told a deputy out there was to give some idea of a description of the man. Do you understand now how your mind was able to work that well under those conditions? You really did an exceptional job in that.
Well, through the whole thing, like I mentioned before, at the beginning, I did think I was going to die. And so from that moment on, one has to have certain goals that you have to set. The first goal, of course, was to live. I suppose the second goal was to get untied. The next one was to get help. From getting help, getting to the hospital. You know, you have to have a successive set of goals. And if you can keep this going and you can keep your mind active, whether you die or not, you're at least psychologically attuned, whether you're in shock or not. If you can keep arguing with yourself, praying, doing anything to keep your mind off of yourself, or at least just not lapsing back and just saying, well, it's no use.
Brian will probably be able to leave Queen of the Valley Hospital fairly soon. But where he's going from here is being kept secret in the event that the man who attacked him and killed Cecelia Shepard on Lake Berryessa a week ago Saturday tries again.
Cecelia's funeral took place that fall, and all of her family and friends were in attendance. She was buried at the St. Helena Cemetery, where she remains at rest. Brian returned to class at Pacific Union College roughly 3 weeks after this violent encounter, his physical wounds healing. It would take him years to overcome the emotional trauma of the terrifying ordeal and the tragic loss of his friend. He would later go on to become an attorney in Southern California, and while he often refuses to answer questions from the media about the Zodiac attack at Lake Berryessa, he has never really shied away from it. He spoke to Channel 7 KGO in the aftermath of the ordeal and shared his thoughts about everything. Quote, "My first thought was that he was a sluggish, slow, rather stupid individual. I have been able to see by the way he operates that he is neither of those. Not that he is a genius, but he is definitely not stupid. He's got plans. I cannot believe that anyone normal could do the things he is doing. I just wish that he knew his need. And if he could only realize his need and see some type of medical authority, he would be far better off."
We had a complete lack of communications. I kept trying to talk to him, and I think he could still use help. I mean, I don't really think he knows his need. And if he could only realize his need, and he doesn't have to, if he could just call the authorities or call a health institution of some type, I really think he can be helped. He's not beyond hope.
Over the next week or so, police and the media struggled to come to terms with the newest attack on a young couple surrounding San Francisco's Bay Area. The first attack, which took place on Lake Herman Road, between Vallejo and Benicia, California, occurred on December 20th, 1968. The two victims, David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen, became victims of a shooter utilizing a .22 caliber long rifle. Several months passed, with no correspondence from the killer of that ordeal. Then, Darlene Ferrin and Mike Mageau were shot at Blue Rock Springs Park in Vallejo on July 4th, 1969. The killer, who would later identify himself as the Zodiac in correspondence with police and the media, used a 9mm Luger pistol throughout this attack. He later confessed to this crime, not only in correspondence, but to police dispatcher Nancy Slover a short time after the shooting took place. Now, another young couple, Brian Hartnell and Cecelia Shepard, were attacked. This time, though, it was not in the middle of the night on a quiet lover's lane. It was out in the open, along scenic Lake Berryessa, at 6:30 p.m. on a late summer afternoon. This attack, which took place on September 27, 1969, came just 2.5 months after the last assault, and the killer used a different weapon yet again, this time choosing to stab the young couple. So you had a serial killer, who was cognizant enough to use different weapons for each attack. So far, he had used a rifle, a pistol, and a hunting knife. And each time, the female victim had received much more violence than her male companion. Betty Lou Jensen and Darlene Ferrin were each shot more times than David Faraday or Mike Mageau. And in this last attack, Cecelia Shepard had been stabbed twice as many times as Brian Hartnell. Many in the media didn't know what to make of this madman quite yet, but Napa County Sheriff's Captain Donald Townsend put it best when responding to a reporter's inquiry.
This guy is a pathological psycho killer.
Paul Lee Stein was born on December 18th, 1939, and spent his entire life in California. Born in the town of Exeter, he had grown up in Modesto, before moving closer to the San Francisco Bay Area in his adult years. In 1969, he was a 29-year-old grad student who worked evenings as a cab driver while attending San Francisco State University, where he was working towards his doctorates in English. He was also married to a woman named Claudia and the two were looking forward to a long life together. These long nights, in which Paul would attend class all day, selling insurance in his available daily hours, and then work on nights and weekends as a cabbie, were all stepping stones to a much more comfortable life for Paul and Claudia Stine. They currently lived in a cheap apartment in the Mission District, but were looking forward to brighter, more leisurely times ahead. On Saturday, October 11th, 1969, roughly 2 weeks after the violent incident out at Lake Berryessa, Paul Stine reported for his cab duties at around 8:45 p.m. This time is documented by his employer, Yellow Cab, who had records verifying this time. Over the next hour or so, he would drive through San Francisco, eventually taking a customer out to San Francisco International Airport before returning to the city itself. Wanting to make this a profitable evening, he decided to head out to downtown San Francisco, the theater district, where he would be able to find customers quite easily on a Saturday night. At around 9:45 p.m., Paul received a call to pick up a customer at 500 9th Avenue, which would take him upwards of 10 minutes to make it to. As he began to head out to this destination, he was hailed by a single customer on the corner of Mason and Geary Streets. This customer, a man, entered the back seat of the cab. He asked, or told, Paul to drive him to the intersection of Washington and Maple Streets, near Presidio Heights. Presidio Heights was the area of San Francisco closest to the San Francisco Presidio, which at this point in 1969 was still an active military base. It was playing a supporting role in the Vietnam War. For the next few minutes, these two men traveled west towards the Presidio for a trip that is about 3 miles in length. Despite the destination being designated as the corner of Washington and Maple Streets, as written in the fare book of Paul Stine, the two ended up a block further west, at the intersection of Washington and Cherry Streets. It was just before 10 o'clock that the man in the back seat of Paul Stine's yellow taxicab used a 9mm semi-automatic pistol to shoot Paul once in the back of the head. The shot was fatal, and Paul's life, which was showing so much promise, ended that very instant. At the time that Paul Stine was shot, 3 teenagers, including 2 children of a noted surgeon named Lindsay and Rebecca Robbins, rushed to the windows of their apartment overlooking the street below. The teenagers, who were about 60 feet away from the shooting, were not even sure of what they were seeing at first, but they would describe the following events happening from their perspective as they phoned the police at 9:58 p.m. The man from the back seat of the cab, who had presumably shot the driver, stepped out onto the pavement and then leaned into the front seat. He hovered over the driver for a moment before using a rag, which he had presumably brought with him, to wipe down the interior of the cab. Most likely, he was trying to get rid of any fingerprints. Then, he began walking off in the direction of the Presidio, towards the Julius Kahn playground. These 3 teenagers described this man as having a noticeable walking style, almost like he was lurching forward, with his head down. These 3 youngsters would become some of the only verifiable witnesses to have seen the Zodiac killer's face, and their experience has remained one of the sole breaks in the case that police would have over the next half-century. 2 separate sets of police officers were in the vicinity of the shooting, and they would approach the scene from opposite directions. San Francisco police officer Armand Pellicetti and Frank Peda were the first to arrive at the scene, just minutes after the call had been placed to police. As their police report later indicated, they arrived, quote, red light and siren, to the crime scene. They had been told to look for a black male, due to confusion with the police dispatcher and the call being made by the 3 youngsters, and they had not seen any suspects that warranted suspicion as they pulled up to the scene. As they pulled up behind yellow cab number 912, Officer Pellicetti noticed the 3 teenagers out on the street, approaching them in his squad car. He exited the vehicle and tried to usher the 3 youngsters back to their home. He asked them what they had seen. Quote, "It was then I was told it was a white male. I couldn't get to the radio fast enough at that point to let everybody else know. The kids had told me whoever had done this crime had left the cab, went out the door, and seemed to be wiping the cab down and reached into the cab, and ambling or walking down Cherry Street in a northerly direction, kind of towards the Presidio. I walked that way myself. I did not run because there are innumerable alcoves and parked cars. so I went down following every technique I knew so I didn't get my head blown off. Officers Pellicetti and Peda took statements from the 3 teenagers, corrected the call going out on police dispatch, that it was a white male instead of a black male, and began walking down the street in the direction that the man had gone. While walking in that direction, up towards the Presidio, as well as the nearby golf course and Julius Kahn Park, he was able to flag down another police cruiser coming from that direction. That vehicle, which contained fellow San Francisco police officers Donald Fouke and Eric Zelms, had been covering the eastern Richmond district of the city that night. Zelms was not Fouke's regular partner, he was just filling in this evening. They had been traveling northbound on Presidio Avenue when they got the call of the shooting, and then they changed their route where they ran into Officer Pellicetti. After flagging down the other officers, Officer Pellicetti continued up towards Jackson Street, where he ran into a man who was out walking his dog. This man did not match the suspect description, but also had no information to share. The 4 officers converged at the crime scene, where Paul Stine remained slumped over in the front seat of the yellow cab. An ambulance arrived to the scene at around 10:10 p.m. and announced Paul Stine as deceased almost immediately. Police officers helped tape off the scene for evidence collection, and spoke with the 3 young witnesses to help get a complete description of the suspect they had seen. The case was soon handed off to investigators, who arrived at the scene later that evening, completely oblivious to what this case would eventually become. Homicide detectives Dave Toschi and Bill Armstrong arrived to the scene that evening in their weathered gray Ford, amidst the stream of onlookers surrounding the crime scene. The 2 had just so happened to be assigned the case, as they were the homicide team on call that weekend. Toschi, who had only gotten a couple of hours of sleep, arrived to the scene with a burgeoning headache and a desire to go back to bed. Quote, "I was exhausted. I went to bed around 8 o'clock. The phone rang at 10:15. I remember exactly what the dispatcher said. You've got a sloppy one near the Presidio. Cab driver shot in the head. I got dressed and went to pick up Bill in Park Merced." The 2 arrived at the scene shortly thereafter, and began examining everything. Another detective had arranged for police dogs to try and track down a trace of the shooter, and Toschi and Armstrong would speak to the witnesses who described what had happened. They heard all of it, about the driver and the backseat passenger getting into a brief scuffle, which ended in a single gunshot. Then the passenger got out and leaned into the front seat for a brief period of time, before using a rag to wipe down the scene, and then ultimately simply walking away from the cab. The meter, which calculated the total for the cab fare, had been left running after this shooting. Toschi and Armstrong found the 9mm shell casing on the front floorboard, which confirmed that the weapon used was indeed a 9mm. They also found the glasses belonging to Paul Stine down on the floorboard, which had been knocked off in either a brief scuffle or as a result of his fall across the seat. As they observed Stine's body, they discovered that his car keys and his wallet were missing. Most intriguing, though, was a section on the left side of Paul Stine's short-sleeved, striped collared shirt, which had been torn off by the perpetrator. This didn't make it into any of the news reports, but would become relevant just a short time later. They were also able to discover a bloody fingerprint within the cab, which would become one of the most important pieces of evidence moving forward. Since it did not match up with Paul Stine, it provided only one possibility, that it had been left behind by the killer himself. Detective Dave Toschi later told a reporter, quote, "There was blood everywhere. We thought it was a robbery from the beginning. We had witnesses, we had a description, we had fingernails. We just figured we're gonna get the guy. I will always wonder if he really was watching us, like he said in his letter." You see, while detectives unanimously agreed that this was a robbery gone wrong, that would change just days later. That was when the mysterious Zodiac began corresponding with the media once again, and he took credit for this murder. This time, he provided indisputable proof. On October 14th, 1969, the San Francisco Chronicle received its first letter from the Zodiac since the letters containing the ciphers were sent at the end of July. This letter, which was postmarked from the days before, October 13th, contained a small piece of a bloody shirt, which would later be confirmed as belonging to recent murder victim Paul Stine. The letter read as follows, quote, This is the Zodiac speaking. I am the murderer of the taxi driver over by Washington Street and Maple Street last night. To prove this, here is a blood-stained piece of his shirt. I am the same man who did in the people in the North Bay area. The San Francisco police could have caught me last night if they had searched the park properly instead of holding road races with their motorcycles, seeing who could make the most noise. The car drivers should have just parked their cars and sat there quietly waiting for me to come out of cover. School children make nice targets. I think I shall wipe out a school bus some morning. Just shoot out the front tire and pick off the kiddies as they come bouncing out. The letter was then signed by the Zodiac's now infamous cross-haired symbol. Many point to this letter as the tipping point of the story, at least regarding the Zodiac himself. At this point, he had claimed credit for 5 murders, with 2 victims, Mike Micheal and Brian Hartnell, surviving their wounds. And from here on out, he would begin to focus more on open threats and causing panic than anything else. It was at this point that the Zodiac began to become more than just a man. He was now well on his way to becoming a myth. Many think that this last crime, the murder of Paul Stine, was his stepping stone to achieving that aspiration. Because in all of the Zodiac's first 3 crimes, the attack at Lake Herman Road, Blue Rock Springs Park, and Lake Berryessa, he had attacked in a quiet, isolated area. 2 of his crimes had taken place in the brink of night, and another had happened at dusk. This, the murder of Paul Stine, had involved a single individual male. It had taken place at around 10 p.m. on a Saturday, and it had happened in a wealthy neighborhood in northern San Francisco. This was no longer a story taking place in the perceived backwoods of the North Bay. This was now in the middle of the city itself. The Zodiac, well aware of how this crime would affect the people in the area, began to take full advantage of that. And this October letter, which threatened children on school buses, was just the beginning of a new reign of terror.
School children make fine targets. I think I shall wipe out a school bus some morning. Just shoot out the front tire and then pick off the kiddies as they come bouncing out.
Now, what are you doing to protect the school buses, particularly in San Francisco, from that?
In San Francisco, we have been, since the first day, since the reception of this note, and up to now and continuing, we have a number of plainclothes officers following buses in the morning and in the evening. We are learning more all the time, but I'll put it this way, there is no one suspect that we're focusing on at this time.